Good afternoon, everyone. What a pleasure to see so many unfamiliar faces here alongside, obviously it's a pleasure to see familiar faces too, of course. For those who don't know me, I'm Dr. Christopher Harker. I'm Acting Director of the Institute for Prosperity. So you're very welcome to our Director's Seminar this afternoon. We're delighted to have Professor Elke Schwartz with us this afternoon. He's going to be giving a talk, as you can see, artificial intelligence and war. And this is clearly an incredibly timely and important topic. So we're really looking forward to hearing what Professor Schwartz has to say. So for those of you who don't know her, she's a Professor of Political Theory at Queen Mary University, London. And her research focuses on the intersection of the ethics of war and technology, with an emphasis on unmanned, autonomous, or intelligent military technologies and their impact on the contemporary politics of contemporary warfare. She's the author of Death Machines, the Ethics of Violent Technologies, which is a publication with Manchester University Press. She's a fellow of the RSA, a member of the International Committee for Robot Arms Control, a 2022-23 fellow at the Centre for Apocalyptic and Post-Apocalyptic Studies in Heidelberg. Amazing. We're going to have to hear more about that. Oh, I don't know if that's good or just scary, but it sounds wonderful. And also a 2024 Labour Hume Research Fellow. So, Professor Schwartz, thank you ever so much for joining us. We look forward to your talk, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks so much for the introduction. Thank you all for coming this afternoon, and for bearing with me as I talk about a not so joyful topic, which is artificial intelligence and war. But I'm trying to make it as, I don't want to say entertaining, but as bearable as possible, let's say. So I'll talk on the broader theme of artificial intelligence and war and also ethics. Necessarily the talk will be broad and breezy in the sense that I'm not going to go into big theoretical frameworks. However, if you're interested in those, I'm happy to answer any of the framing questions you might have in the Q&A. So my topic for today is artificial intelligence in the military domain, because none of the envisioned futures, as I am familiar with, for the wars that are to come, are likely to be able to do without artificial intelligence in some form or fashion. So what I hope you will come away with in the next 30, 40 minutes or so is a sense of what role artificial intelligence plays for military contexts, what kinds of futures are envisioned with artificial intelligence. The second thing I would like you to come away with is a sense of the pitfalls and the challenges and the many intractable problems that artificial intelligence poses in the context of warfare. And then the third point is my plea, if you will, for why thinking about the ethics of artificial intelligence in warfare needs to become much more refined, much more sophisticated, and much more widespread amongst all stakeholders, including engineers, including those that operate the systems, but also the wider public. Because we are finding ourselves in an environment where ethics is really shifted into the margins. Now we are in a very particular and peculiar time of geopolitical instability. I think that we all know this right now. Perhaps to say it with Hannah Arendt, we are in a newly dark or perhaps darkening time. So again, the subject matter isn't going to be too joyful, but such is the nature of warfare, as even Palmer Luckey, the CEO of one of the new, very powerful military artificial intelligence weapons companies, Anduril, knows. He used to work with virtual reality tools, now he's busy with warfare, but it isn't as much fun, as you can see here. But it is important to be talking about artificial intelligence in the military context, precisely against the current climate of global tensions. And with AI-enabled systems already being in use in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but also in Gaza and other conflicts in the Middle East or hotspots in the Middle East, and that with problematic effects that many of us know. It's also important, I think, to be talking realistically about artificial intelligence, because the discourse on AI is very distorted, it's very hyped up, in ways that are extremely helpful, and very often they oscillate between a kind of a dread and doom, or some really unwarranted utopian optimism on which then policies and politics are formed. And I was listening to Keir Starmer today talking about how we should be less cautious and think about bringing more AI into government functions, and I think that's a dangerous, slippery slope. And then I read that his science minister, Peter Kyle, gets his advice from ChatGPT. So, you know, I don't know. Now is the time to just maybe think realistically about artificial intelligence and where we want to use it and where we don't want to use it. Because it seems really that everybody wants to get on the AI train, and specifically AI for warfare train at the moment. And worse still, it seems that all of the big technology companies are wanting a slice of the defense sector right now. So all the big fives are vying for government contract in the military domain. That really should give us pause for thought. Now, some of this has to do with the wildly increased number of military startups that have come into the defense sector. These are backed by really large amounts of venture capital money, and they are putting quite a bit of pressure to make the development and roll out of AI-enabled drones and other weapon systems even more accelerated to, and here I quote from this book, Unit X, to infuse the Pentagon, and of course other defense organizations as well, to infuse them with the Silicon Valley DNA. I think this is a big problem, and why I think that I will come back to this at the end. As it is so often the case, wait a minute, is that what I want? What? No? Apologies, I'm lost in my slides. Yeah, here we go. As it is very often the case with technological innovation, with artificial intelligence in particular, the development and also increasingly the rollout of some of this technology is taking place at a very different time line as the discussions on what ethical problems, what legal challenges we might encounter, and how we might regulate artificial intelligence so as to minimize that which we're all concerned about, and that is minimize harm. As you can imagine, the possible harms with AI and warfare are quite significant, especially if we don't pay enough attention to it and if we follow the mantra that we should have less regulation, not more. As I said before, all of the big companies, Meta, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Anthropic, OpenAI, they're all vying for government contracts, often with promises of, as of late, AI agents for better decision making. But really promises is the operative word here, because there's no robust evidence that such AI agents might be of any use for critical missions, for example. In fact, I talked to a technologist, engineer last year, and he said he wouldn't use an AI agent to book himself a holiday, right? See if he doesn't trust it. So rolling that out for the military sector is fraught with challenges. But this is the direction we are headed, and things are moving really, really fast. Now, that's not a good thing, but it doesn't necessarily need to be so if we are not asleep at the wheel in terms of when it comes to producing norms or thinking about norms and regulation. And I've spent a good amount of time last year and this year at policy meetings and military events and conferences, and I'm always really quite worried about how strong really the allure is for making AI the center of the way forward. The AI system as a way to make war somehow better. It certainly is not a panacea for better warfare, and I think we've seen this play out in the conflicts that we're familiar with that have been quite hot and ongoing and have cost a lot of lives in the last 2 years. And so just to frame this, by cutting out some of the inevitable AI hype, which is rife also in the defense context, a couple of clarifications or demystifications, if you will, up front. First of all, AI is not a runaway train. AI is developed by people for people and for human contexts. but it is increasingly developed by those people with different sets of interests, especially venture capital interests. Again, I'll come back to that in a minute. Now, all too often at high-level conferences, I do hear the words, AI is advancing incredibly fast, it is inevitable that the best AI will win, that we all have to live in a kind of, and arrange ourselves with AI in the future, and so on. This really distorts the fact that artificial intelligence is not advancing itself. It is being advanced. The effort to advance AI is enormous in terms of resources, financial resources, environmental resources, and almost human, and also human resources. It is a human decision to advance AI at this speed. It doesn't need to be like that. There's also nothing inevitable about artificial intelligence, in that we in the future must all speak to our own pocket AI therapist. There's nothing inevitable about it. And that's one of the biggest kind of mantras that I think is worth pushing against. It's a decision made by humans, usually indeed only a handful of humans, for the rest of us humans to have to live with. The second point I want to highlight is that AI is not a magic genie or anything that we can place all our hopes into, regardless of what Elon Musk tells us. It's not a universal remedy which will miraculously help win wars, as Parmalaki here suggests, or make wars better, or bring a swift end to wars and conflict. And I think we're already seeing that that's not the case, because AI is already being in use, and wars are protracted, they're ongoing, and they're quite long. So it is perhaps worth pointing out that AI will bring significant benefits for some tasks, and make things significantly smoother for certain matters of human life, but the fix-all qualities that it is often bestowed with are highly exaggerated. At present, very often we must acknowledge that for the more extensive AI systems, the risks by far outweigh the visible benefits. So for the purpose of today, I will treat AI as a very sophisticated technique for statistical data analysis and processing, to which we as humans give meaning one way or another. And now the final thing I want to point out is that we as humans are always in some sort of relationship with technology, and that shapes how we see things ultimately, what we prioritize, and ultimately how we do things. It changes our practices. So we need to be sure, or at least have a sense of what these changes might be and whether we actually want them. This is true for any technology. This is true for a hammer, the famous saying, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. This is true for trains, for any kind of technology that we're embedded in. But it is also true, and perhaps even more so, for the digital ecology within which we find ourselves today. I usually point to a really old example now, and that is the ways in which our smartphone has created a very different attachment to responding to messages and looking at screens than we ever thought possible before as such. And then I finally want to highlight the glaringly obvious: AI is an industry. You know this. But it does matter for thinking about the future of warfare. It's a very lucrative industry. The global AI market is estimated at 200 billion, forecast to grow at around, to about 1 trillion by 2030. The military AI market is also growing quite quickly. And it is projected to triple within the next 5 years. And the numbers keep getting revised upwards. It's not an exact science, but depending on which service you consult. But really it is a big industry, and a lot of financial gains are likely to be the upshot of that for some actors in that space. Now the defense sector is rife for disruption. It's a very financially robust market, if you will. Global spending on defense has been rising for the last few years for obvious reasons. It is currently estimated at $2 trillion US dollars. So it's not surprising that some industry players, venture capital in particular, wants a slice of that pie. In recent years, some 130 billion US dollars in venture capital funding have been made available to military startups since 2021. And among them are some companies with very aggressive, for lack of a better word, aggressive expansion strategies, and they have really pushed through their market position in the last 4 or 5 years or so. And often they spend significant amounts on shaping the narrative, on lobbying, on creating the need for their products, on shaping the market itself and the practices around that market, so that a greater need for artificial intelligence in warfare, in the defense sector, becomes a necessity rather than an option. I'm happy to expand on this. This is the research project that I've been doing in the last couple of years in the Q&A. So these are my kind of disclaimers or parameters. Ultimately, here a little bit more on the trend of venture capital as shaping and influencing the defense markets. But I want to get to the point where we think about what AI is in the military domain, why it matters, what it does, where is it used, and then also what might the future of warfare look like. Now, I've consulted an AI to find out what the future of warfare will look like. This is what it gave me. This is DALL-E, and you can see the prompts. Now, none of that is very helpful. It's not very AI forward at all, and it speaks of a certain very kitsch kind of aesthetic. I don't know what happens here with the teeth in the front and the top there. The fact really is that military AI, or AI in the military domain, can be many, many things. It can be used for streamlining logistics operations, for example, to get assets or equipment from point A to point B in the most efficient manner. For that, AI is really good. Or AI can be used for predictive maintenance, or already is used for predictive maintenance for vehicles and equipment. AI is used for transport. It can also be used for translations. So there are many, let's say, more mundane logistical type of tasks, tasks that deal with materials and objects and straightforward processes. Any task that benefits from speed and efficiency and optimization and streamlining through systems logic is really ripe for AI technologies to make these processes a lot smoother and efficient, right? So especially when we have objects and material in the mix as such. So this is quite good, and you can have quite a narrow form of artificial intelligence that takes place and takes its reference points from a relatively closed environment with, limited set of parameters, if you will. There are some very useful, and by today's standards, quite boring ways in which AI can be applied and should be applied, perhaps, in order to make things more smooth and efficient. Now, AI will play a significant role in all of this as part of a wider system or system of systems, in which platforms and software applications are kind of layered and connected, and systems start communicating with one another. So that is what AI is really good at, dealing with systems and systems of systems as such. And these, in what we call the non-kinetic arenas, there are perhaps fewer ethical and legal qualms, although not none, I would say. But where things get a little bit more thorny or problematic is when it comes to the kinetic kind of stuff, basically all the stuff that has to do with lethal force. So anything that involves the decision to apply lethal force with some sort of AI-enabled system in the mix. So think in terms of robotics, plus AI, plus a weapon. I think you're all familiar with that Spot the Robot Dog. Boston Dynamics has this dog that is at all the autonomy conferences. There's always a dog stomping around, or a robotic dog stomping around. So imagine something like this, but with an AI-enabled rifle on top. Both the US and China are working on such systems. But really the future of lethality, and this is what the word is the word lethality is often foregrounded when we talk about AI and weapon systems. The future of this lethality revolves around greater speed, greater autonomy, and agility in drone swarms, for example. It revolves around a move towards machine speed and autonomous integration for greater combat mass, so more drones, more systems working together. So, thousands of small dispensable drones that are set loose onto a battlefield or a battle context. And it also revolves around a move to connect assets and capabilities across the various domains, so sea, air, land, cyber, connecting the domains to speak to each other, like is illustrated here with the Joint All-Domain Command and Control Program, JATC2 for short. This is a very illustrative, kind of very confused, wild graph as to how this is intended to work. Very often, the JATC2 is likened to the Uber for defense systems ultimately, so that all the systems speak to each other. So this interconnectivity or multi-domain kind of interconnectivity is also what is envisioned for the future, and artificial intelligence is indispensable for that, or necessary for that. Now, advances in AI raise the hopes of significantly reducing what some call the labor and the power-intensive tasks of manually identifying targets. They hold the promise, if you want to call it a promise, of shortening the kill chain and aid in accelerating the speed of decision-making. And this collaboration, or a type of outsourcing of cognitive labor for tactical and strategic decision-making is said to function better, faster, smoother with AI, but that of course also raises the greatest, biggest legal, ethical issues, but also questions about strategic utility. Now, these kinds of systems are already in use. You might have heard of Project Maven. Here, this used to be the official logo of Project Maven. Project Maven was the US's pioneering AI program, and it had contracted back in 2018, it started in 2017. It contracted Google, but Google employees protested against it in 2018, and so then finally Google said, okay, we're not working with Project Maven anymore. The project still exists, and it is alive and well, as you can see here. And other companies, for example, Palantir also, to us known from its contract with the NHS, is working with Project Maven, advancing Project Maven. And these systems are reportedly already being used in the Middle East, for example. You might have also heard of systems used in Gaza. They have evocative names like Gospel, Lavender, and Where's Daddy. These are reportedly AI decision support systems, they're called, that are tasked with generating recommendations for targets, whether that's buildings where suspected operatives might live, as it is the case with Gospel. Lavender reportedly is an AI decision support system that produces kill lists, so it focuses on people, it discovers human enemy targets based on certain parameters, which are very often very crudely drawn. And then the very bizarrely named Where's Daddy AI system, which reportedly tracks potential targets to their home and alerts forces when they are back home so that they can presumably enact a strike action then. So these kinds of uses of AI do not constitute an autonomous weapon system as such, but they are systems in which the AI plays a significant and increasingly important decision role. They don't just identify and track pre-stipulated specific targets, a specific vehicle or a specific object, which was like extensively vetted ahead of time by a team of humans and lawyers, but rather the AI system is used to suggest possible targets based on a certain set of parameters, certain characteristics at high speeds and great volumes, advancing these suggestions very fast. So these systems are seen as the future in decision-making and warfare. Now, the crucial part here is that they suggest the target, right? The crucial term here is target discovery, right? Discovering what targets should be targeted, or target acquisition. So they play a role, these AI systems, decision support systems, play a role in who should be targeted based on a number of input parameters. And they basically, if we want to put it crudely, they increase the productivity in the act of killing. They basically make targeting itself more efficient. Now, in order for that to work, AI targeting systems need a range of sensors and other data to statistically assess what constitutes a potential target. This is then given as a percentage, let's say a 95% confidence, that a suggested target is indeed an appropriate target. Now, these parameters can be set very widely or very narrowly. So they can be as widely as all men of military age can be identified as an appropriate target, or they can be very narrow, where you say, well, only persons with a specific military insignia holding what is clearly identified as a rifle aimed at friendly forces, and so on. Or very specifically to say, well, only this specific person that we've identified. But more and more what we see is that the crudely set parameters tend to dominate in order to find more threats or to expand the threat landscape. And also to not, as it was reported in the context of lavender, not run out of targets. Now, the data itself comes from a range of sources. In fact, in order to function well, it needs a large volume of relevant data. Even to just function at a very basic level, large volumes of relevant data are required. So, excuse me, I better drink some before I keep going. So AI targeting or AI decision support systems constitute this crucial component in accelerating the kill chain. And while they're not autonomous systems in themselves, the way the human operator or teams of humans are embedded means that they have to adopt the logic of the system in order to not slow it down. So if the goal is to suggest a lot of targets, the human teams who then approve the targets or the strike on the targets often have no more than a few seconds, or let's say 20 seconds, in order to make that decision. Now, in warfare, where tempers are always running high, where things are never really calm, that tends to prioritize action over inaction. So really, we want to think about AI in warfare not just as a robot or the Terminator, but rather as a system of systems. It's never just one AI doing one thing. Usually there are layers of systems that work in tandem because they have to. And within this, the human is then embedded. This also means that more and more of the real world needs to be captured in data, and the more the real world environment is routed through artificial intelligence, the better these systems can function, right? So it's an obstacle that the world doesn't necessarily bend to the logic of data alone, but it must become bent or must become pliable for calculative processes if the AI is to work appropriately. Now, the problem is that you can't systematize all of human life, no matter how hard you try. And so there's always a number of challenges associated that we already know about. So I want to come to some of those challenges, but I do want to stress this configuration with the human in some sort of action loop. Now, the principle of having an artificial intelligence system in any kind of action loop is the displacement of human control. The point of the system is that they operate at machine speed and with cognitive processing capacities that exceed that of the human, wherever that human is in or on or by the loop as such. So the idea is not to work with human speeds. The idea is for humans to work with machine speeds. And that inevitably means displacing human control or altering human control to the point where it's not really human control anymore. And we've seen this trend towards greater machine autonomy for a long time, kind of slowly encroaching as a normality, pulling the human away from the action loop. So that is really the name of the game. So that kind of throws a spanner in the works if we want to think about meaningful human control or appropriate human control of these kinds of systems in warfare specifically. Now, ironically, some human is always somewhere in the AI picture. You know, data has to be labeled usually by humans. And often where those humans sit becomes increasingly invisible, and they are placed with wildly varying agency, either a lot of agency or non-agency, no agency at all. And I also want to highlight that the more intricate the system and systems of systems become, the more likely it is that the system's logic will determine the course of action as such. I think I'm going to go back to this one. Whether that's a weaponized robot dog or an AI-enabled targeting systems or fully autonomous weapon systems embedded in a joint all-domain and control, a command and control structure, the technologies are really systems of many, many parts, sensors, information networks, hardware, transmitters, also human operators as such. So what we're dealing with then is not a new military tool, the AI as such, a thing that is used in an isolated and well-controllable manner. Rather, we should consider really always the systemic nature of that and the webs of relations that these emerging, and they're always emerging in their capabilities and interactions with humans, that these emerging technologies produce, which are always likely to produce unforeseen, uncontrollable, and other emergent kind of outcomes as such. So what is the problem with AI in military affairs? Well, there's lots of problems as such. We can already imagine many of them in the kind of mundane sort of contexts. Now, it's very difficult because we don't really have a robust set of empirical data as to all the things that can go wrong with artificial intelligence in a military setting. So the discussions are usually quite speculative, right? We don't have a long history of data of all the things that could possibly go wrong or that have gone wrong in the past. So we have to deal with hypotheticals and speculative kind of ideas. However, we can already infer an awful lot about the considerable limitations of AI-enabled autonomous type technology simply on account of what we know about AI technology itself and specifically machine learning and how it works for a real-world environment and those dynamics. Now the bottom line, especially for warfare, is this. AI is still not very intelligent when it comes to really complex, open, and highly dynamic human environments. In fact, still, and I've been talking about this for almost a decade, but certainly in the last 5 years more specifically, and still to this date, technology experts today would argue that AI-enabled autonomous systems or weapon systems are nowhere near reliable enough to be able to operate in highly dynamic and uncertain contexts, let alone be able to distinguish reliably between friend or foe or, any kind of messy affair in an always problematic kind of battlefield. So very often the industry representatives will say, this is the future. The technologists will say, wait, it's not ready yet. And then everybody else has to deal with some sort of speculative edifice that may never really come fully to fruition. First of all, there's a problem of data. Where are you going to get reliable data from to train a system on something as unpredictable as and complex as war? Every war is different, and for good reason. It's about adversarial kind of actions. As in war, you don't necessarily do the expected activity as such. So it's not a static kind of environment from which you can learn, or even like a limited dynamic environment from which you can learn. Enemies will be busy spoofing, breaking, hacking, any kind of system. War is always filled with surprises, with the unexpected, with subterfuge. So we have to take that into consideration. I don't know if you remember the good old AlphaGo spectacle, I'm just going to call it for lack of a better word. It was big news. AlphaGo beat the grandmaster at the game Go. Well, fast forward to 2023, an amateur made a really, really super simple move and completely floored what is by all accounts a very sophisticated system. So it was a subversion of grandiose simplicity. In warfare, you can expect that to happen on a frequent basis or at a larger scale. These kinds of efforts to subvert a system that works on systematic kind of processes. Now add to that AI systems need frequent updates. What happens to the rest of the systems, the other systems that work with it, when the system needs to be updated, right? It's an interlocking. So an AI system isn't ever just, okay, this is what you have and here's your warranty and now you use it, but rather it relies on frequent updates. So in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, systems get updated every 10 days at the very minimum. If the updates are not available, the system becomes obsolete relatively quickly. So there's a lot of glitches or possibility for glitches, not to speak of other glitches like generative AI's hallucinations, and so on and so forth, which should give everybody pause, or at least a little bit of worry, because a lot of LLM systems are being sold to defense organizations at the moment. Now, all of this will lead to harm. This is the reality of warfare. And most likely to the harm of civilians, which by all accounts tend to be innocent. Where things in war go wrong, harm is likely to come to those that are not intended to be harmed. It's also clear that contrary to lifting the fog of war, there's a potential to produce a different kind of fog, a system fog of sorts. And again, that holds an enormous potential for escalation and, again, further harm at speed. And by bracketing out the human increasingly from this accelerated action chain, the checkpoints or nodes for de-escalation, intervention, mitigation, those check nodes shrink considerably. This is why regulation and some more focused discussion on ethics is needed, because it's the law and ethics that aims to curb harm and warfare. That's why it's there. So there are a number of fundamental questions that arise with AI in the lethal mix. Much of this applies to systems that are fully autonomous, but it also applies to systems in which the human is little more than a functional element in the wider action chain, approving hundreds of computer decisions in an hour or so. There is the worry that such configurations produce a sort of accountability gap, where nobody can feel responsible or be held responsible for a decision if something goes wrong. The system misidentifies a school bus for a tank, a crutch for a rifle, misidentifies a data trail produced by an aid worker for that of a terrorist. So it gets really thorny when you can't really hold anybody specifically responsible. You hold the engineer responsible, you hold the commander responsible, the operator, the system itself, some have suggested, but that is a meaningless concept. And there's an even greater worry that if you distance the human ever further from the lethal decision and increase the responsibility gap, then the threshold by which you decide to use violence becomes lower and lower. In other words, the use of force becomes a first, not a last resort in this kind of configuration. And if not a first resort, then certainly one of the many options on the table. Now, that's directly contravening jus ad bellum, ethics of war kind of stipulations, by which one should always take good care that war is the last resort. And even more so when targets become a little more than just data points or elements that are marked as bad and put in little squares. There's a certain dehumanization, making into objects, objectification at work, which is amplified by the necessarily digital objectification of targets. Right, because the system can only recognize objects, never subjects, never humans. It is always edges and lines and pixels, and these are of objects, not humans, not human lives. So the literature shows that this objectification often leads to a dehumanization, and dehumanization, of course, has played a significant role in greater willingness to engage in greater levels of violence, if not mass atrocities in the past. Now, the laws of war and international humanitarian law are geared towards curbing the worst of these human excesses. They are not designed with machine logics in mind. So the human and all the messy relational stuff about humans, that does remain vital for restraint in warfare. And I know that the argument has frequently been made that taking the human out of the action loop can make warfare a lot more humane, more precise, tempers don't flare so much. But we don't have evidence for that. To date, we don't have evidence for that. So until I see the evidence for that, I will argue against that, and I will argue that it actually lowers the threshold to the use of violence. Now, discussions on the regulation of AI-enabled autonomous weapon systems have been ongoing for a good decade at the UN Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons Forum, which just concluded last week again. But also the UN General Assembly has the issue on the docket, especially autonomous weapons. Other initiatives have popped up that seek to address a pressing problem of how to act responsibly with AI in the military domain. There are a lot of politically motivated disagreements, and the processes for finding a legally binding instrument is very slow. But over the years, there have been advances made. There has been a sort of like a convergence around the concept of meaningful human control as a requirement for such weapon systems. Now, very briefly, before I go deeper into the ethics question, meaningful human control requires that there should be some human control, oversight, checkpoints, and the likes somewhere always in the AI-enabled action chain. Now, early iterations of this concept were intended to limit the use of AI in military matters. So, meaningful human control suggests that systems must be predictable, they must be reliable, understandable, they must afford sufficient time for a human to intervene. All problems with artificial intelligence by all accounts. But these kind of ideas have become enshrined as principles in various approaches to military AI ethics. But they really serve as a kind of a guide to what the difficult problems will be rather than a solution. If we only check these tick boxes, then we have a responsible AI system or an ethical AI system for military purposes. So there's always a risk that having a set of principles serves kind of as a stand-in for actual ethical deliberations which are necessary in any kind of context of conflict. Now, it's a good start, of course, to think about these things. What can meaningful human control possibly mean? But the question, or my question always is, what happens if it cannot be met? Simply because of the system's attribute. Would militaries be willing not to use AI-enabled targeting systems because they fall short of these ethics principles or the stipulations for meaningful human control? Because if we just scratch the surface on the human-machine complex just a little bit and its emerging properties, the situation becomes really quite fragile. I've alluded to it before. In fact, I've argued in the past, and I continue to argue, that meaningful human control is made impossible in most situations in which an AI-enabled targeting system would be super useful, right? Where it's about speed and scale. And with that, the possibility for exercising or having moral agency and understanding moral responsibility for lethal actions becomes significantly curtailed. Research has shown that we have considerable limitations when it comes to human-machine teaming. For example, we have a tendency to overtrust the machine decision. So we have automation bias, that's a key term here. We tend to lose situational awareness, especially when it comes to AI recommendations, especially when we don't know or understand how the system was trained or how it arrives at its output as such. And there's also a shrinking time horizon within which we are able to act or intervene. So we have an inferior position in the hierarchy of the system within which we are then embedded. The allure of AI is always greater speed and scale, and these accelerated time horizons generally are prioritized, and they produce a sense of urgency. And I've already mentioned it before, they privilege action over non-action. So we might come back to Project Maven, for example. The point is that the operator or operators are supposed to sign off on as many as 80 targets in an hour of work versus 30 targets without AI in the mix. So everything then becomes about workflow management. It becomes about a productivity issue. But if you think about warfare and the aims of warfare, and specifically winning in warfare or ending war and producing an environment in which peace can prevail, that is not the right approach, right? It is not a workflow question. It is not a logistics item alone. This is simply on account of the fact that war is a human, social, political problem. It is not a technological problem predominantly. It isn't even an engineering problem predominantly. But really, as military technologies are envisioned as increasingly complex, connected, agile, operating at machine speed, the more tempting it is to fall prey to the illusion that war is primarily an engineering challenge as such. So I'll come to close now with my final section. And I want to more clearly come to the point of ethics. And it gets even more polemical than I've already been with you so far, but please bear with me. I kind of lost control over my slides, but that doesn't matter. I'm going to leave that on because it is pertinent. In the last 12 months, maybe longer, I've been talking to a number of audiences, often audiences with military background or affiliation, military affiliation, also policymakers, about ethics in military artificial intelligence, not unlike what I've kind of been talking about today. And in these conversations, in these usually smaller circles, there's one question that always emerges, or has emerged in the last 12 months with greater frequency than I've ever seen it before. Since I've started studying ethics, violence, technology, and the combination thereof. There's the variations to the question, but the ethos, the underlying skepticism, is the same regardless of its ultimate formulation. The question is this: isn't ethics a luxury, especially for warfare? Isn't ethics for peacetime? And it's not all fair in war. Can we afford ethics in times of violence and death? Must we not do what we need to do in times of crisis? Now, there are various ways in which this frustration with ethics resonates in the context of military artificial intelligence, and there's a reason for that. The two are most irreconcilable in most ways. And so it's been very tempting to see both the law and its humanitarian principles as a type of checklist, as a set of variables, of principles that could and should be incorporated into machine logic as such. Remember, the more intricately we as humans are embedded in technological systems, the more likely the system's logic will come to dominate. So, a growing digital dominance amplifies this idea of ethics as either techniques, where the language of utility and efficiency dominates, where humans are predominantly captured as data points or numbers or variables, and more fluid categorizations of war, such as injury, psychological trauma, the destruction of a political community, are often bracketed in favor of a computational process to assess what harm comes to the innocent or civilians. Now, with this calculative dominance, that's been underway since the 1960s and 70s, actually, but it's really manifesting today. With this, moral blind spots are ultimately created, and with greater technological autonomy, these blind spots are likely to become larger and make potential for harm for those caught in the crosshairs of AI systems significantly worse. And add to that a wrong committed through technological recommendation or a decision to rectify that is likely to be an uphill struggle as such. So there's a greater plausible deniability of those that possibly have abused the system's capabilities or are using the features to obscure human error, human oversight, or human failure. Remember, the human is always somewhere embedded or with various agency in the action loop. Now, contesting technological flaws or failures or contesting technological authority requires political will. It requires adequate resources, which are often short in supply. The Horizon scandal is instructive in that way. AI-enabled systems will not bring an end to human involvement in warfare, but they will likely work further towards a distortion of our human relationship to violence as such. So the influx of venture capital money really has eroded the possibility to give ethics a fair hearing. Ethical concerns can neither be appropriately accommodated by the aims foregrounded and pursued by venture capital money and endeavors, which is basically a turnaround of investment within a certain period of time and at a scale that is larger than any other type of financial instrument investment, quite substantial gains. Nor can this particular type of investment accommodate a ethical deliberation which requires a slowdown, because venture capital pursues a mandate of growth at all costs, and at high speed that comes with the territory. Additionally, not all venture capitalists as such, but certain very powerful players in the technology sector are not particularly well known for their appreciation of or adherence to regulation or ethical constraints. Quite the contrary is the case. There's often a very flippant ethos that comes with the technology sector and its startups, and there's sometimes outright irresponsible attitudes to violence and harm displayed by key influential figures in this space. Is quite a poor role model for the utmost seriousness of military engagement and the high moral stakes involved in warfare. And so I want to be very clear. I want to end with ethics. I want to be very clear. Warfare is an unfortunate, terrible, destructive human affair. It's not a technical affair that can be made better with artificial intelligence or solved with AI. It's not possible. In this context, ethics is not there to dress war up as something that is great to have as a luxury or as dressing things up as soft and sweet. Ethics is crucial for social functioning. That applies nationally and internationally. Ethics takes into account that fighting is not a normal state of affairs, that it should not be prolonged, but that it is an exception, or at least that it should be an exception. And so thinking ethically about warfare in the context of artificial intelligence and otherwise is intended to provide motivation to exercise restraint in war, precisely so that in after war, something that comes beyond and not an intractable continuation of war at all moments, it becomes possible, so that bridges can be built, as then ways forward can be found, dialogue can be established, trust can be established in some way or another, further down the line, of course. This is the social to the technical in warfare and in military technologies. And in this, ethics is as much a strategic consideration as it is perhaps moral philosophy or a type of philosophy. So with this plea and this complete catastrophe of not sorting my slides out, I will leave you and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. So, thank you, Dr. Schwartz, for a fascinating talk. For those who are not familiar with the IGP seminars, we usually have a little bit of conversation between the host and the speaker, just to give you time. I've already seen a hand pop up, but we'll just give you a few more minutes to think of questions. So, write them down or get ready and we'll pop around to Mike in a sec. So before we open it up to the floor, I would like to begin where you ended and think about the different humans, as you say, differently positioned. So, you talked about VC at the end and earlier, engineers, commanders, so sort of thinking of soldiers. Are there, in terms of how we engage with these different humans, do you think there's, again, being tactical, particular actors that are more amenable to the arguments that you're making, and can we be strategic about who we engage?
I think it's important to engage all stakeholders, really, all humans involved, and increasing that is all of us, because as more technology companies vie for government contracts, the more they will rely on your data for producing the AI products that they're ultimately selling. So I think what I've been seeing in the last 3 or 4 years, maybe more, is a kind of a widening of the idea of the civilian context as also a military context. And so I think we're all involved. And I think all the stakeholders ought to be addressed in that way. Now, speaking to military personnel, very often they're quite open to some of the stronger points I have about ethics and the restraints and restrictions limitations of artificial intelligence that I highlight. But it is, like many political points, it is contested. There are different ideas of what should happen and different visions of the future that are very often, and we see this in a non-military context, very often they are immune to all the cautious voices because the drive towards prioritizing innovation and acceleration is so powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? Like the predominance of the capital motive.
Yeah.
Beyond the kind of military motive, and thinking back to the announcement of the UK shifting its budget from aid to warfare, essentially, and it was the former head of the army, so actually this is a bad idea, so thank you. Picking up on that then, one thing, you know, from my graduate student days 20 years ago, we were in the post-9/11 world about wars, a lot about smart weaponry and a lot of social science critique. So one of the legacies of debates about law and ethics, I mean, you mentioned history since the 60s and 70s, so we're bringing these debates and ideas and challenges with us into the AI era. How do they function? And you know, I'm thinking of smart weaponry just because it's more recent and there's some similarities.
Yeah, it's all a trajectory, right? So one of the things that I would also push against is that we are in a kind of like a completely novel or, you know, hitherto unknown kind of environment right now, because this is a trajectory. And most of my work, I go back actually to the origins of artificial intelligence in the 50s or 40s and 50s. And I look to those who have made those technologies. So Norbert Wiener, for example, one of the grandfathers of cybernetics, he worked towards not autonomous weapons, but greater autonomy in systems, but certainly automated type of systems. And he was acutely aware of exactly the things that we are encountering today, that we as humans have a different type of cognitive function and a different agency. And he was warning back in, I think it was the 1960s when he wrote that there's a really problematic prioritization of know-how over knowing what we're doing this for. And he famously wrote a letter where he said, no, I'm not sharing any of my research anymore after, I think it was Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And he said, this is it. We as mathematicians have a responsibility to think about the things that we're producing and the kinds of contexts that we're bringing into life. Now, fast forward a little bit. So a lot of what we're seeing today with these AI decision support systems had their origins in 2001, right? When Palantir was kind of tasked with like, well, you know, what can you do? What can you find? This is when this idea of finding targets based on metadata was ultimately born, and Palantir was at the center of all of that. So the problematic discussion of implications of drone warfare that we started highlighting in 2004 onwards, basically, or started seeing really materialize in 2010, 11, 13, those kinds of problems, ethical, legal challenges, they remain. Because the logical infrastructure remains. The algorithmic way of trying to find threats and targets and identifying dangerous individuals, that remains. It's a direct continuation. Now you have speed and scale attached to that, which is what you can do with artificial intelligence ultimately. But yeah, the edifice is the same. But you know, every step along the way, first, norms get eroded ultimately, right? So first you erode the norm of target assassination. That wasn't really something that was not frowned upon before targeted killing became possible with drone warfare. Now it becomes more about lethality, right? Greater scale of death is through mass is the way forward. So recently I heard that somebody wants to bring back anti-personnel landmines as a way to fight wars, right? So there was a conference in Lithuania where that was advocated for. So undermining norms, eroding legislation that were really hard won in the interest of speed, scale, and winning some wars. Now, which wars can be won like that? I'm not entirely sure.
Thank you. And one final question before I open it up. So I was thinking that, yeah, it's precisely, funny enough, we're on the right slides. Somehow the slide is, maybe it's anticipated my thinking, which is silly, but so we have this tech bro who's saying that weapons aren't as fun. And you know, when I saw it, I was thinking about the role of culture, gamification, and specifically what I would be interested to talk more about is how cultural representations of AI in warfare or something similar feed into ethical deliberation, maybe at the public scale more than, or you can take it however you like. So I was thinking of things like 2001: Space Odyssey, or the Terminator films, or some of these more recent TV series about tech bros and how they things like the Dropout, for instance. So yeah, it's a sort of broader question around culture and ethics.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I spent a lot of time last year because I was doing this project on the politics of apocalyptic artificial intelligence. And by that, I was really interested in what political utility does this dystopia, utopia narrative that we see coalescing around, in cultural manifestations around artificial intelligence, what kind of politics does this do? So I watched a lot of, listened to a lot of podcasts, watched a lot of these conferences, but also dug into all these op-eds, which all have a kind of almost a PR function in some ways, right? It's all public relations, it's branding, it's marketing, and AI is always cool, right? The tech bros are always cool. And some of the figureheads of these companies like Palmer Luckey or Alex Karp with Palantir, or even Elon Musk before he completely, lost his mind by all accounts. There's something about the valorization of this individual which is just cool and thinks differently and just does what needs to be done. And all the people that are kind of interviewed with Andrew, they all have that ethos of like, we are the geniuses. You wouldn't understand what we're doing, but we are the geniuses. And so ethics doesn't matter in this wider. It's a libidinal thing almost, right? It's about sexiness and at some point in Pamadaki, I couldn't find it, but he said, "Let's make defense sexy again." So it's a foregrounding of an industry that is ultimately, I only find the German word, that is made to look as something that is unique, unusual. In the military startup or in a startup scene, it's unicorns. It's something that is mythical, and so a lot of these narratives that are spun around that are equally fantastical and mythical, and to give priority to what they do rather than allow us to think about what is this for. Yeah.
Fascinating. Okay, so opening up, this hand was first, so we'll go to this gentleman, and then Nikolai. So maybe we'll take a couple of questions.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you for sharing your insight on AI-enabled warfare. Coming from a peace-loving civilian perspective, I have a twofold question. So first question is, how do we limit the impact to civilians? So I'm thinking because you have exposure to all those military leadership. So is there any way that we can influence them, or when they build AI products in the future of warfare, don't target civilians or try to reduce any damage casualties to normal people? Because maybe they can precisely target just the military enemy rather than us. Second on that is, as we are on this page, we're all gamifying a very scary warfare situation. Is there any way that we can influence the military leaders so that they don't see people as numbers or as a game in the future when killing can be so easily done, damage can be at scale with just a press of a button? Is there any way that we can make those leadership that works in military to be more human, have more empathy? And if you have seen this or heard of this type of conversation, could you share a bit more details of how their thinking are evolved, or if there isn't any in the past, what can we do to help them bring this into conversation? Thank you.
So we're going to take a question from Nikolai, and then we'll move on.
Thank you so much. I want to start with a very brief comment about something that I found very disturbing, and then a question. So when you mentioned that you were talking to people and they said that, how can we have ethics during war? Shouldn't we be focusing on the war as opposed to ethics? I found that incredibly perverse, because this is precisely the moment when ethics becomes relevant So by saying that, they're essentially saying that ethics at all is irrelevant. Because if you don't have these challenges posed to you, then ethics doesn't become a matter of concern in everyday life. But the question that I wanted to ask you is about the relationship between the development of AI for war externally and the development of AI technologies for internal policing and repression of dissent. Because the two very often go hand in hand. Whenever we have militaristic regimes and wars abroad, that seems to be complemented with internal repression of dissent. And I always like to kind of emphasize this dimension because many of us might be thinking, these are just international wars that do not affect us, and they can happen to affect us very, very quickly. So I just wanted to ask you to comment on the relationship between the two in this economy of AI technological development. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Thank you both for these excellent questions. So, what can we do? So I work with an organization called the International Committee for Robot Arms Control, and ICRAC. And as ICRAC, we're also part of the campaign to stop killer robots. And so the campaign has, for a good decade, tried to do exactly the work that you say, what can we do, right? So highlighting this digital dehumanization, highlighting how easy it is, the slippery slope towards objectifying humans, which the history of warfare has shown that if you dehumanize humans and if you provide a kind of like a veneer of authority and processes of routine, that has the capability to lower moral restraint, and that always leads to not always, but often can lead to mass violence. So the campaign suggested, and we're on track to kind of put forward, at least in the context of autonomous weapon systems, a two-tiered kind of regulatory system that would be legally binding, but states still have to adopt that. And that basically means you can, like, those types of autonomous AI-enabled systems that would target humans would be banned. And those types of systems that cannot be meaningfully controlled would also be banned. And only those kinds of autonomous systems that target, let's say, an incoming missile or that have military objects as their targets, they can be regulated in ways. So it is about really banning things. And the counter-argument is always like, well, but, how can we ensure that people adhere to that? And what if our enemy doesn't? But unless we begin with this norm, we end up absolutely nowhere. So one thing is to support legislation, and that legislation then institutes a norm by which we as humans can say, we don't want this. This is horrible. This is a horrible future. Because we don't have evidence, but inference we can make, and that suggests that civilians will be caught in the crosshairs. We know that drone warfare, very often civilians have to bear the brunt of the cost of this type of warfare. It's not just military costs associated with it, it's always civilian costs. Civilians do bear the brunt of warfare, and most of the recent wars that we have seen and we have known. Now, interestingly, military leaders are not evil. And they're much more open, as I was saying, they're much more open and understanding of the fact that they have a responsibility to the context within which they wield violence. It is often policymakers, it is often those that have a decision role that are more likely to want these kinds of technologies rather than military leaders, or even those that have to then work with the systems. I've spoken with military personnel, and they said, we think this is a terrible idea, and it is not necessarily going to make us safer. It's not going to bring more stability to the globe in any kind of way. So I think my drive, you can join the campaign to stop killer robots and, lend your voice to that. But it really is also about shifting the narrative, that these are the tools for better warfare, because that's simply not, it doesn't bear out by evidence at this point, right? So shifting that narrative that is the inevitable future. The most likely outcome will be, this is my projection. Maybe in about another 10 years or so, the entire AI industry will have not had the returns it needed in order to make the technology work fully and smoothly. it will collapse in some ways. We will still have AI, but in a very narrow sense. There'll be in some sort of inferior form in systems that then people have to find workarounds, and they'll be a bit rickety. So ideally, it will end up not working the way it is envisioned, and we don't have to think so much about it. But I'm really worried about the norms and kinds of relationship to violence it institutes. That's really what I'm worried about, that it opens the door. But it's not too late, we can push back. I mean, this question of ethics, I agree with you. So very often that comes up in the Russia-Ukraine context, and Ukraine is defending itself. And I completely understand that this is it's a fight for survival, right? So you can't necessarily think too much about what you're supposed to do or not supposed to do. However, Ukraine is actually adhering to the laws of war for most part of this. So ethics does matter. So bringing in that question is really kind of chipping away at the relevance of it. But with this question of a spillover, we would like to call it, right? There's an interlinking between that which is possible or rolled out in the warfare context and that becomes possible in the domestic context. It always has been. All the technologies that we use, including the internet, is a military technology, right? It was invented, it was called ARPANET at the time. It was to connect the military computers in an interesting way. And then it was brought into the civilian context, and we know it as the internet today. And many other types of technologies, including algorithmic type of technologies, AI technologies, are born out of warfare. And then they're rolled out into or developed, and people make a lot of money with in the civilian kind of context. But it isn't a far stretch, because these are technologies about data gathering, surveillance, control, right? So it's entirely feasible or possible to say that we see spillover effects, by which warfare is seen as constant policing. We've seen this with drone wars as well. It's more about surveying, identifying where the potential threats are, and then intervening. So the Joint All-Domain and Command and Control initiative over here is one of those things. So I was watching a presentation on Project Maven, and the idea is to use Maven as a future warning system, ultimately. I don't know where it is now. No idea. This is not the presentation I thought I sent. Anyways, so it is intended to kind of have it as an interface by which you can identify, and this is a quote, good from bad behavior in potential hotspots. So that you can say, well, do we need to look at this kind of gathering of the people here? Is this something suspicious that we should intervene into? And so, it becomes about policing, controlling, surveying, and that can be rolled out as widely if it's possible to interconnect various domains, although there's a question mark and there's also a high cybersecurity risk, to then use that for a domestic kind of context. And indeed, in order for these systems to function, you do need surveillance. You need more data, right? And you need an extensive kind of surveillance system in order to be able to make them work in the first place. So that can become a question of infringement or transgression in a domestic context as well.
Thank you. So we've got a question here, a question there, and then a question here. So if you could keep them as brief as possible so we can get as many questions in. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I'm just interested in what's the general consensus around fully autonomous systems and machines? And you touched a lot on sort of like human in the loop, having basically sort of criteria gathering and targeting. But what about having that spot robot over there with a machine gun on top, or having, for example, a drone be able to autonomously decide who are we going to kill? What's the consensus in the, I guess, around government leaders and military leaders?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Let's gather the three questions, yeah, and then we'll pass back to Jules.
Hi, thank you very much for the wonderful talk. You were speaking about how the global military industry is very large and there's a lot of money going into it, especially from VC funds now. I have a personal belief that you can't really get humans en masse to do anything unless there's a fiscal reward. Do you think there's a market for peace which can counteract the military market?
That's a good question.
And then just two very
Is there Thank you for the presentation. I've just got a question about the AI. Because during the Cold War, the nuclear weapons is used as a deterrent because it's so powerful and destructive. So do you see AI would become a deterrent in the future?
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for those questions.
Fantastic, nice and concise. First, on the consensus on autonomous weapon systems, no, there's no consensus. Everybody would be terrified of that in some ways, right? Or a swarm of lethal drones that kind of descend. Now, there are already autonomous systems in existence, and so some of these loiter munitions that are remotely controlled can potentially also function on the last mile as autonomous type of systems. But the debate is ongoing as to what kind of legal framework, whether we should have them in the first place, or whether they constitute really such an egregious infringement on our human laws, our human ways of being, that we should not have them. Right? So many countries who are likely to be on the targeted end of these kinds of technologies in the global south and smaller nations have coalesced around saying, no, we don't want them, especially not those that do target discovery of humans and establish a profile and could potentially take humans out in a short time frame. There's a growing block of states at the CCW, but also under the umbrella of the United Nations General Assembly, that says, no, that needs to be regulated. This is not a future we want. There are those, of course, incidentally, those that, of course, produce those weapons, America, Israel, Russia, to a lesser extent China, and other associated nations, and there are always political dealings to do with that say, no. If we regulate, we'll stifle innovation, and also our enemies will do it, and then we're going to lose out. So that's an ongoing, really long-lasting debate. It's been going on for 10 years now. It starts with there not even being a consensus on what autonomy is in weapon systems, ultimately, right? So the broader definition that the International Committee for the Red Cross puts forward, and there are variations in the US definition, is that there are systems that independently and without human interference take care of what's called the critical functions, and that's the selection, the identification, selection, tracking, and then taking out of targets without any human in the loop. The UK, for the longest period of time, has said autonomy means that a system needs to be just like humans, make deliberations like we do as humans. So really a broad philosophical kind of like understanding of autonomy. Now this is kind of, and it's a political disagreement ultimately to sort of, hamper the discussions. That's been put to the side, and people are really trying to coalesce a lot more around this question of meaningful human control. The consensus is still that without, the Americans call it appropriate human judgment, others call it meaningful human control, that without that, these weapons shouldn't exist. The crunch point right now is, what does it mean? Can we control them meaningfully, or what is appropriate human control? So that is an ongoing political debate as such, not resolved. Meanwhile, these weapons do get developed and tested and rolled out. So it is an urgent time. Oops. A market for peace, that's a fantastic question. But unfortunately, I've tried to think about this too, but what do we sell? It is true, the motivation is a financial motivation, and that seems to really dominate in ways that is very difficult to undermine or erode, with any kind of common sense counter argument that there will be no future if we just go down this path. One would have to commodify peace in some way, and if you have any suggestions, let's talk about that. But I think incentives do need to be created. The incentives need to be highlighted. The incentives need to be foregrounded, and these are not just financial incentives, but kind of a longevity, sustainability dividend of some sort. I'm not sure, but certainly something to think about. This AI as deterrent question is interesting because that is part of the narrative that the big military artificial intelligence producers are putting forward. All right, so very often you hear when the film Oppenheimer came out, Alex Karp of Palantir had this big op-ed in the New York Times, I think, and many others piled on. It was, this is our Oppenheimer moment. We have to create these weapons, but we must do it with care. So the Oppenheimer film actually coming out did a lot to create a twinning of nuclear weapons as this horrible, terrible, most awful and bizarre weapon that serves as a deterrent, and then twinning that with artificial intelligence and the conjuring up of autonomous weapon systems as so horrible that they can act as a deterrent. I don't buy that story at all. Because AI functions in very different ways, it's not as remotely as reliable, and I also really bristle at the idea that we have to create weapons of absolute mass destruction in order to not have war. That's a really strange, I understand deterrence theory and mutually assured destruction, all of that, but nuclear weapons and AI weapons are not the same. And I think putting them in the same boat valorizes this autonomy in weapon systems in ways that maybe it shouldn't be. Maybe it should be highlighted how brittle these things are and how potentially unreliable they will be and how not so powerful.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we've reached the end of time. It always rushes up so quickly and swiftly, and just as the conversation seems to start to get going, of course. So, can you join me in thanking our wonderful speaker, Dr. Schwartz?